Good evening and a very warm welcome to the Black Hole. Today we are going to screen a documentary titled A Thin Wall. This film has been released in 2015 and I would like to share a brief synopsis of it. It's a documentary about memory, history, and the possibility of reconciliation. It focuses on the partition of India in 1947 but derives lessons that remain urgently relevant even today. It has been shot on both sides of the border, that is India and Pakistan, and it has been a personal take on partition rooted in stories passed down from one generation to another. It is written and directed by Mara Ahmed and co-produced by Surbhi Dewan. Both filmmakers are descendants of families torn apart by partition. And after the screening, we will have Ms. Mara Ahmed, the director, for discussion and question answer session on Zoom. So without taking more time, let's start the screening. Thank you for your arrival.
सारे बहन भाई एक बड़े से घर में रहते थे और सामने हमारे घर के बहुत बड़े बड़े नीम के दरख्त थे और उनके आगे जाके एक बहुत बड़ा तालाब था।
Mara Ahmed is best known for her non-linear multimedia work. She's a filmmaker. She produces documentaries, soundscapes, but she's also a visual artist and who paints and draws. Mara was born in Lahore and educated in Belgium, Pakistan, and the United States. Her practice reflects these displacements and multiplicities. She has directed and produced 3 films, including The Muslims I Know, which was released in 2008, Pakistan One on One in 2011, and A Thin Wall, which was released almost a decade ago in 2015. Her films have been broadcast on America's public broadcasting service and screened at the international film festivals. And this particular film has been shown in India multiple times. This was the first time that it was shown in Pakistan. Mara is currently working on The Injured Body, a documentary about racism in America that focuses on voices of women of color. Mara's artwork has been exhibited at galleries in New York and California. She was awarded a NYSCA grant in 2023 for her interdisciplinary project, Return to Sender, Women of Color in Colonial Postcards and Politics of Representation. Her websites are neelamfilms.com and maraahmedstudio.com. So, good morning, Mara.
Good evening to all of you.
It's good to have you. And I think everybody enjoyed your film. Thank you for allowing us to show it in Pakistan for the first time. So before I begin, I'd like to know a little bit about your work, not just about your work as a filmmaker, obviously we'll discuss that, but your work as an artist. What kind of mediums do you paint with, and what kinds of places, and do you deal in watercolors, oils, and what do you make? I think that's something that we start with.
Sure. So I do a lot of collage work, which is mixed media, in which I use, and this is something that I'll talk about later when we talk about the film, and perhaps it was evident when you saw the film, that I am a collage artist. I like to work with many different materials, and fabrics are really important to me. South Asian, particularly Pakistani fabrics, that I use them extensively in my work. So in my collages, like the analog collages, there's fabric, there's print, there's paint, there's photographs. So that's why it's very mixed media.
And how did you come about towards filmmaking?
So filmmaking is actually my second career. So my background is actually in business and in finance and economics. And I worked in finance for a long time. And then now, quite a long time ago, almost 20 years ago, I decided to switch completely. I resigned from my job and went back to school and learned art making first. And then filmmaking, specifically because of my first film, which was The Muslims I Know. And I tell people that that's the reason I became a filmmaker, because of just the environment, the very problematic environment that we had in the US after 9/11, where there was all this Islamophobia coming from all of the mainstream media, and absolutely no pushback, and also no opportunity for Muslims to be a part of that discussion. So I decided to make a film in which would be a kind of platform that would give Muslims an opportunity to tell their own stories.
Obviously, my grandparents also migrated from India, so this is something I relate to. But your parents were very young at that time when they moved here. But what other reasons were there to make a film about partition? What were your goals?
I think one of the main reasons was really trying to preserve these oral histories, which are a part of our legacy, and which also, in a way, tie India and Pakistan together. Because I feel like the generation that lived through the partition, like my mother, who was a young child, I think she was 4 or 5 years old at the time of partition, that generation is the last generation that has lived experience of what it's like to be on the other side of the border, and to have these very intimate connections with the other, what we now think of as the other. It's the last generation that had these experiences and these relationships. And so we felt that we were losing this generation, sadly, and that it was extremely important to capture all of these histories, these oral histories that we were going to lose. So that was one of the main reasons that we wanted to make the film. And then another reason for me was also to kind of look back to a time when people were able to coexist in extremely multi-religious, multilingual, multi-ethnic communities. Everything was not perfect. It never is. There were certainly structural problems, yet people were able to coexist. And I feel that that is an art that we are losing, not just in India and Pakistan, but all over the world. And so we wanted to learn from that.
Yes, as you said, that things weren't perfect back then. And in your film, there is also that depiction that people tell that there were Muslim areas back then and there were Hindu neighborhoods. So it wasn't completely mixed. There was still segregation, but it was not as abrupt as it is now. So, But I would like to ask you about the people that you chose for this film. Some of them obviously are your relatives, and they are from that part of India, and they moved to Pakistan. But what about the others, and how did you choose these locations? And also about the impact of partition, because in this film you also show people, some of whom are settled in the United States, some are settled in Canada, some are settled in Rwanda and in so many other places. So the impact of partition has spread to all parts of the globe. So was that a conscious decision to show that?
Yes, actually, one of the people who is in the film, Uzma Aslam Khan, who is a brilliant Pakistani writer and a very dear friend now, her beautiful writing is in the film. And she said something very lovely about how it seems like with the partition in 1947, once that we started to scatter, we just continued to scatter all over the world. And I think that's true. And so many people whose voices are included in the film are actually part of the diaspora. They don't live in Pakistan or India. They're part of the diaspora, which is where I am as well. But we do still have these very strong ancestral linkages to the land, to the people, to the culture, to the language, and to the histories. And so all of that, I hope, came through in the film.
Yes, quite a bit of it did. What was it like to work with another filmmaker, someone from India? How did you come across Surbhi Dewan? How did you two get together and decide to do this?
Yes, I actually met Surbhi in Rochester at the Rochester Institute of Technology, where she was doing her master's in film. And I was also taking a workshop at RIT, trying to finish my first film, which was The Muslims I Know. And so we met there. And as soon as we met each other, we started talking about the partition, because she said, I'm from India, but my family is actually from Pakistan. And I said, I'm from Pakistan, but my mother's family is actually from India. So immediately that was a point of connection. And as we got to know each other and became friends, we felt that that we were meant to make a film together about this legacy that we had grown up with. So that's how we met, and that's how we decided to collaborate on a film.
Did you find it difficult to shoot in both locations, or did you have any problems during that?
Well, that's why I think collaborating with Surbhi was such a good idea, because I think it made for a much richer film. All of the footage that's shot in Delhi was shot by Surbhi, and then all of the footage that's shot in Lahore was shot by myself. So we actually either one of us never crossed the border. I filmed everything in Lahore and she filmed everything in Delhi. And that's why I think it makes for a much more interesting film, because even the voiceover is twofold. The story is told in my voice as well as in Surbhi's voice. And I think that is also interesting, because it's not just that we were born in different countries and that we come from different geographies, but it's also that our voices are quite different. Surbhi chooses to focus on the personal and kind of tries to create these parallels between her own life's journey and the journey of her ancestors who lived through the partition. So she tries to make these connections. And then for me, it was really important to place the partition within the context of British colonialism. So my voice in the film is the more political voice. So I think it makes for an interesting mix.
Yes, and some of it relates to yourself and to Surbhi as well. You say that you traveled a lot, you moved from places to places, and you could relate to the idea of being migrants. And Surbhi also, after moving to the United States, she says home is a complex idea. So how much of it was this something that you yourself relate to because of your movement from one place to another, from Belgium to Pakistan and then to United States after your marriage? And do you at any point feel at home in any one place?
Oh, that's actually a really good question. And I talk about this often with friends, is that because I have lived in so many different places, in 3 different continents, actually, and during very important parts of my life. So my entire childhood was spent in Brussels, in Western Europe. And then, I went to college in Pakistan. So, that was also a very important phase, a very important part of my life. And then after marriage, I've lived all of my life in the United States. I've had my kids here, and I've really become an adult and grown up and become who I am here in the US. So what that means for me is that I think that I never fully belong anywhere. I'm always a little bit of an outsider, a little bit of a misfit everywhere. And I think there are more and more people like me as travel has become much more easier now and the world much more global. My experience is not something rare. It's actually now there are many people like me. And I think it's good to be like that, because it allows you to connect with many different kinds of communities, and never be fully immersed in just one community, but be a part of many different communities and feel a certain level of comfort everywhere and discomfort everywhere as well.
That is true. But I would also like to ask you that this feeling of being an immigrant, it never vanishes. Like it's the same for your mother. These people, they were 5 years old when they moved, and now they're in their 80s, and yet they still identify as migrants. So why does this thing not vanish away, even for those who spent like most of their life over here?
I don't know. I think that for my mother in particular, that it's very interesting to me that she was so young at the time of partition, yet her memories of their home in India, for example, are so vivid. It's really surprising to me. And I feel like maybe the trauma was such that everything just became imprinted on her brain. And so it still lives in her brain in a very vivid way. And she has like this attraction for people from India. Whenever she meets someone who's from the other side of the border, she's always very drawn to them. And I think maybe it's because of this sense of loss that she's had all her life, because she lost something and was never able to return, home. Maybe it's that loss that makes it so special for her to connect to people who come from there, a place that she could not return to.
True. And I would like to ask about the structure of the film. Why is it so much like a book, and what is the crux of the film, the message of this film that you want to give?
So the film is really truly like a notebook, and it contains many different political, poetic, and personal voices and stories. And I wanted this rich texture. I wanted the film to be a conduit for many different kinds of voices, not just my voice or even Surbhi's voice. And so I wanted those multiplicities in the film. And that's why it's kind of like a notebook that tells many stories. And then the message of the film, I guess, is that I wanted it to be a very human film, to tell very human stories. And a filmmaker friend of mine once said that the film conveys a universal aching. And I guess that's what I wanted to achieve. So I was very happy that that's how she felt when she saw the film.
Now, in Pakistan, when you mention the word muhajir or anyone migrant, it usually goes towards the first thought that comes to our mind are Urdu speaking migrants. But you focused on the Punjab and to remind people, particularly in Pakistan, that there was a lot of movement between the two parts of the Punjab. And why did you choose that? Obviously, one of it was because your own family was from that. But was there any other reason?
Yes, I mean, my mother is what you would call Urdu speaking because she's from around Delhi. So she speaks this very beautiful Urdu. But that's, even that is part of the Punjab. And my father's family was actually already in Lahore and in what became Pakistan. So they were already in the Punjab. So the Punjab region is important to me. And then Surbhi's family is also from parts of what is now the Pakistani Punjab, the Pakistani side of the Punjab region. So obviously this area was important to both of us. And of course, Punjab is important because that's where, the line was drawn. That's the land and the culture that was mutilated in 1947. So it is at the center of the partition in many ways.
Tell us more about the transitions in the film. You mentioned earlier about the fabric that unrolls and rolls back. What was the significance of that, if any?
Yes. So like I said, because I'm a collage artist and I work with mixed media and I love to use fabric in my collage work as a visual artist, you see that in the film as well. And the reasons that I'm attached to Pakistani fabric or South Asian fabric is, number one, because it's so beautiful. Number two, because I'm very conscious of the fact that a lot of the very intricate work, for example, embroidery, is done by women. And so I'm very aware of the quiet work that women do. And yet it's, fabrics or embroidery is always classified as craft and not art. And so it makes me ask, I have to ask the question, who makes these decisions? How do we decide between what is classified as art and what is craft? And is the work of women, classified as craft because they are women? So there's all of these interesting questions. And then in the film, it was also a tribute to South Asian women. The fabric that you see in the film are basically saris and dupattas. So it's fabric which is wrapped around the bodies of women. And as we all know, the partition led to extreme, horrific violence against women, specifically against the bodies of women. And so I wanted to, this was my way of giving a tribute to the women of South Asia. And then the final reason for using that fabric is that it is very thin. It's almost transparent. You can see through it. And so it reflects the title of the film, which is A Thin Wall, which is a thin separation between people who lived together for centuries. And And by the way, the title of the film, A Thin Wall, comes from a poem called The Six Snapshots of Partition by John Siddiq, in which he says, partition sounds like a thin wall made of simple materials between rooms that can easily be taken down. Take the word in your left hand and feel its weight. It's nothing, just a few sheets of paper. So A Thin Wall actually comes from that poem.
Yes, and I think you included John in this film. So
Yes.
But about the collective memory in shaping historical narratives, do you think that at this point both countries are forgetting partition? It no longer matters, or despite the fact that it has had a great impact, that it no longer in the new generation does not consider it important?
Yeah, that's it's an interesting thing. You hear one of the, because we did some vox pop. Vox pop in documentary filmmaking is literally voice of the people, and it just means asking the same question and asking random people to address that question. And so we asked people to talk about the partition, whether it was a good thing, what were their views on the partition. And we did it both in Lahore and in Delhi. And one of the young women, some of the young people, do seem to say, well, the partition was bound to happen because there was no way that, Muslims and Hindus could live together. And so it had to happen. And so that's a very different way of looking at the partition as compared to older people who have actually lived through the partition and for whom it was a very painful process. It was a process of tearing something apart. It was a very painful thing. And they still feel a lot of nostalgia and a lot of ache about what was lost. So that disparity between how young people think about the partition versus how older people think about it was very interesting to me. And I think that as both countries are becoming more and more nationalistic and are in a way rewriting history to make it more homogenous and more pure in some kind of way, more Muslim or more Hindu, Islamicizing more, and Hindu is Sanskritizing more, for example, in India. I think that we are just going to, move further and further away from our common heritage and our common history, and we are going to lose those linkages, which I think are so important. So that's why it was essential for us to record and preserve these stories.
Also, it's very funny that the idea of partition for everyone at that time was that it would not be so permanent. Everybody had left their stuff behind, hoping to one day return, their furniture and stuff. And not just ordinary people, even Muhammad Ali Jinnah left his house over there and with the hope that he would one day return to Malabar Hill. So I think our idea today of what partition is was very different from people at that time. They all thought that they would one day be able to travel back and go to their homes again.
Yes, I mean, that's part of how the process of partition was so badly done. Like, even if it had to be done, the British were not interested anymore. They just wanted a quick exit at that point. And so the army, the police, any kind of institution that could have ensured some level of law and order were disbanded prior to the partition, prior to 1947. And people didn't really have any information about what the partition meant. They didn't even know where the border was going to be. So it was very difficult to plan anything. And everything was very uncertain. And so I can't even imagine what it was like for people to live through that. And I think as the leaders on both sides were saying that both India and Pakistan would continue to be multi-religious nation states, many people thought that they might be able to come back and reclaim their property and their things, their homes. I think no one really understood the finality of the partition, the way that it played out.
Also, I think this film shows that it was ordinary people who helped others, but it was also ordinary people who killed others. And those people may well be walking amongst us. Their grandchildren may never know their bloody role in that because they just went back to becoming ordinary citizens of India and Pakistan after the killing they carried out.
Yes. So I want to say two things about that. The first is that a lot of the violence that happened was organized. I think many times people like to portray the violence as just being spontaneous and like people just went mad, they went crazy and just started killing each other. And of course, there must have been some of that as well. But a lot of the violence that happened was actually organized. For example, the stopping of trains and killing of all the people who were on board the train, which happened on both sides of the border, was not something that could just be done spontaneously. It was organized violence. Now we have to remember that, for example, like I said, the army had been disbanded prior to the partition. So you had a lot of people who were in possession of weapons, and who were now free agents. And so there was a lot of organization behind the violence as well. Many people, when they're interviewed about what happened to their families, talk about the violence coming from the outside. Like they were outsiders, people that they came outside of their villages, people that they didn't know. So that is also an important part of what happened in 1947. And then the other thing that I want to say about the violence is, and this is something that Ajay Bhardwaj says in the film, who is an Indian filmmaker based in Vancouver, and has written like this really wonderful essay about the partition. And I was so impressed by it that I contacted him, and we're friends now. And his work is also a part of the film. What he says is that it's very important, it's essential for both India and Pakistan to have some kind of reckoning with the violence that happened on their own side, with violence that was committed by their own communities. So rather than always blame the other, why not look more closely at what happened in our own communities? How did the violence happen? Try to understand it and make sure that it doesn't happen again. So I think that is a very important kind of acknowledgement and reckoning that needs to happen.
Also, at that time, there were two different reactions from people. Your mother in this film says that she was very happy when she moved to Lahore, and she was happy. She didn't care that she had left her friends behind. And then on Surbhi's side, her grand aunt, I believe, she said that she was in pain the last time she saw Wazirabad and ek hook utha. So the reactions even at that time were too different, depending on their ages and stuff.
Yes, absolutely. Because I think my mother was younger, perhaps. She was very, very young at the time. So maybe her reaction was different. But also, she from a very young age, I've heard stories of the journey on the special train and how there was blood everywhere because the passengers who had crossed the border prior to my mother's family had actually all been killed inside the train. And what a horrible journey that was. Whenever the train would slow down, people would panic because they thought maybe someone is going to stop the train and kill us. So after going through all of that trauma, I feel like once they arrived in Pakistan, maybe they felt safe. They felt that finally now they were safe. And maybe that's the relief that she's expressing. But people who were older and maybe people who didn't have such a traumatic experience when they crossed the border, because people cross the border in different ways. Some people walked across the border. So there's also like a difference in socioeconomic class, I think, which is very important. Many people walked across the border, which was also a horrendous experience and very, very difficult. Many people died along the way. Some of the older people, some of the people who were ill died along the way. Other people took the special train, like my mother. And then there are also some people who flew in a plane and were able to cross that way, which is, a very different experience. So I guess it depends on your experience. I guess it depends on your age, on all of these things.
So back to the aesthetics of the film, you used some paintings and drawings and animation instead of photographs from that era, which you could have easily got from some archive. But you chose that
Yes.
for a particular reason.
Yeah, so whenever you think about the partition, I think in your mind, the first thing you see are these black and white photographs, many of which were taken by Margaret Burke White, who was an American photographer. And so someone from the outside, this white woman from the outside trying to capture this violence, which was very intimate, but also very large scale in a foreign country. And so I wanted to, because these photographs are so ubiquitous and also because they represent a certain way of looking at the subcontinent, from the outside, I wanted to shy away from them. And so I decided to use animation and writing and photography and poetry that is all produced by South Asian artists. Many of them are in the diaspora because, so am I. And so I connected with them. But they all have these very strong ties to the subcontinent. And so that was important to me, that be the artwork that I use in the film to evoke the idea and the realities of the partition. And then another thing is that I wanted the partition not to be like this black and white episode, this monochromatic episode in history that happened a long time ago. I wanted it to be very fresh and very vivid and very modern looking, contemporary looking, because I feel that the partition is still with us. The remnants of British colonialism are still very much with us. And so I wanted it to be fresh.
And what were the challenges faced while making this documentary, other than obviously you not traveling to India and Surbhi not coming to Pakistan? But what were the other challenges, such as finding funding for it or other challenges that you may have faced?
Well, one of the challenges was simply because it has so many multiplicities in it, was just the technicalities and logistics of it, collecting all the material from different places and different peoples, working on different projects at different times in their lives, and being able to collect and collaborate with them and collect all of that material. Some of the footage had to be reshot, like the footage, especially that Surbhi shot in India. A lot of it had to be reshot over the years because we were having some sound issues. The sound wasn't very clean, so we had to redo it. So the logistics of the film, it took 7 years to make the film. So the logistics were complicated. And then in terms of funding, we were actually very lucky. Post-production is the most expensive part of filmmaking. And that's at the end of the film, when you have a production house actually do the color correction, the sound engineering, the transitions, the text in the film. That's really the stage where the film is changed from something that looks very amateurish into something that looks professional. So it's a very important part of filmmaking, but extremely expensive. And so Surbhi and I did a fundraising, a crowdfunding. We did crowdfunding on Indiegogo, and we were able to meet our goal. And so even though that was a challenge, we were able to deal with that through crowdfunding.
Right. You describe this film as being about reconciliation. What does that look like for you? And you say that this film remains relevant today, almost a decade later. So could you explain that? And also, how do documentaries and other such things help in promoting reconciliation and peace?
So for me, reconciliation can mean many different things for different people. But for me personally, what it means is a more porous border. Like I don't think that India and Pakistan are ever going to become one country or one entity. As such, I don't think of it that way, but a more porous border, which facilitates movement across the border so that there's more interaction with the other. I think that would be part of the process of reconciliation. Another thing, like I said before, is the reckoning of the violence that happened in our own communities. I think that is a very important first step in being able to achieve any kind of reconciliation. And finally, I think a move away from nationalism and ideas of purity and homogeneity, and more thinking in terms of the region, in terms of South Asia, the broader, larger South Asia, so that we identify more as South Asians and not as Pakistanis or Indians or Bangladeshis or what have you. And I think that kind of regional thinking then can make it possible for us to address common problems which are very much there and which are never addressed. For example, poverty, food and water, housing, and all kinds of inequities and injustices that happen in South Asia. So I think we need to think as South Asians and then address these problems.
All right. My last question to you, and after that I'll open the floor for questions, is that you, I believe, lived in Islamabad as well
Yes.
at some point. So something about that. When was that? And also, when are you next going to be in Islamabad so that we can screen some of your other films with you here in person?
Oh, I would absolutely love that. This is the first time that this film has been screened in Pakistan, and it's a film very much about Pakistan and India. And, it's been screened many, many times. I would say hundreds of times in India, because Surbhi is based in Delhi, and so she can facilitate that process. For me, it's a little bit harder. I don't really have that many contacts in Pakistan anymore. I've been away for too long. But it would mean everything for me to share my work in Pakistan. That would mean so much to me. And I did live in Islamabad in the 1980s. It was an interesting time during General Ziaul Haq's regime. And when the war in Afghanistan was going on with the help of the Americans and all of that very interesting political stuff. But I have wonderful memories of Islamabad. It was, I think, much smaller, a much simpler place, fewer people in those days. Now it's hard for me to even recognize Islamabad. It's so built up, it has changed so much. And it's so much bigger now than it used to be. So because it was smaller, it was a very safe place for us. I remember, I was in school at the time. We used to go biking with our friends all over Islamabad. There wasn't that much traffic. So it used to be a very beautiful, safe place, surrounded by the mountains, just gorgeous. So I have lovely memories of Islamabad.
Well, then I hope you'll be here soon so that we can screen some of your films in person. I'll open up the floor for audience to ask any questions.
Would you like to say? Okay.
Thank you very much for, getting the chance to see your movie. It was really, really nice. You actually, the question that I had, why it took so long for the movie to be seen in Pakistan, you answered now in the end, if it was really logistical. But I was wondering, perhaps more generally, do you feel there is a difference in interest in, these remnants of partition between the generation in, let's say, Punjab in India, whose families have experienced but who themselves have not experienced partition, and the same generation here in Pakistan, and perhaps then on the third side, the diaspora, like yourself, or people who live in the UK and the US, in terms of interest in these kind of stories. In India, the book by Anchal Malhotra, I think, was quite, recently was quite popular and got a lot of attention on also bringing together these very personal stories of partition. But I was curious. I was suspecting a bit that there is perhaps a difference in interest also in India and Pakistan for stories like this, which personally I don't really, I cannot really judge. So.
Maybe there is. That's a good question. Maybe there is a difference in how people see the partition. I know that when I started working with Surbhi, she told me that she was very surprised by my mother's experience of feeling relief when she read partition and kind of feeling a sense of love for this new land that was going to be her land, her home. And because she said that it was so different from the feeling in her family, which was just a deep sense of loss and a deep sense of sadness. And that's all they felt, was this sense of having lost something. So there was no sense of relief or no sense of, that's at least in Surbhi's family, that's what I heard. So that was interesting to me, the juxtaposition of those two types of experiences. And then in India, for example, I feel like maybe they have organized around the partition a little bit more. They have a partition museum, for example. So A Thin Wall was just recently, like a couple of weeks ago, I think, was screened at the Partition Museum in India as well. So maybe there are more spaces which are specifically interested in the partition. But otherwise, it's hard for me to judge. I'm not exactly sure how people feel. I can say that the younger generation feels very differently about the partition versus some of the older people. Because even I remember when the film was coming out and we were promoting on social media, there were some comments from younger people saying, these particular comments from people in India, younger people in India saying, get over the partition. It's done. Like, why keep talking about something that's done? It's done. Move beyond it. So many people said that. It's irrelevant. It has nothing to do with us anymore. So there's that kind of thinking as well. So, but I'm not sure that there's a specific difference between India and Pakistan as such. I'm not sure.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम
वालेकुम।
मैम, आई एम सॉरी मैं ये मूवी देख नहीं सका क्योंकि मैं लेट हो गया था, लेकिन आई हैव अ क्वेश्चन के दैट माय ग्रैंडफादर इज़ फ्रॉम इंडिया बट ही इज़ फ्रॉम श्रीनगर। ये वो जो डिस्प्यूटेड लैंड है कश्मीर का, वो वहाँ से माइग्रेट हुए थे एट वेरी, आई थिंक कह रहे हैं मैं 5 से 6 साल का था जब वो पाकिस्तान आए थे। और इसी तरह एक उनके फ्रेंड थे, वो भी सिद्धपुर वाली साइड से आए थे। तो मैं हर वाली कॉन्ट्रडिक्शन क्यों देखता हूँ? मेरे दादा कहते हैं कि मैंने बहुत खून देखा, इसलिए पार्टीशन हुई और हम यहाँ तक आए, कि मैंने छोटी उम्र में बहुत कत्लो गारत देखी और इस तरह की चीज़ें देखी। लेकिन जो दूसरी तरफ से जो सिद्धपुर से उनके फ्रेंड थे, इंडिया सिद्धपुर से, वो कहते हैं यार नहीं ये ठीक नहीं हुआ था, क्योंकि मैं तो बहुत हंसी खुशी रह रहा था। वो कहते हैं मैं 14 साल का था, मेरी तो बहुत सारी मेमोरीज हैं आज भी इंडिया में, और कहते हैं मेरे तो भाई भी वहाँ पे ही रहते हैं इंडिया में। तो हमेशा आपने मूवी बनाई है, तो वाज इट पार्टीशन ठीक हुई थी या गलत हुई थी? आपसे एक छोटा क्वेश्चन है क्योंकि आप
That's a very good question too. इसमें मैं 2 चीजें कहना चाहूंगी। एक तो ये कि कश्मीर के बारे में फिल्म में इतनी ज्यादा इंफॉर्मेशन नहीं है. It's not really something that I go into a lot of detail because I feel that the story of Kashmir is really important and it's not something that I could treat marginally in this film. Like I need to make another film about what happened in Kashmir. I'm friends with a lot of Kashmiri activists, so I'm very aware of the complicated history of Kashmir and what's happening there right now as well. So I didn't want to just treat it marginally, and that's why I do mention Kashmir in terms of the princely states, that were either forced to join India or Pakistan, but I don't really go into the details because I think it's such an important subject that I need to make a whole film about it. और जो दूसरी बात आपने कही कि where do I stand after making this film on partition, सही हुई या नहीं हुई? That's a very complicated question for me because I think about it in 2 ways. I think about it academically and, based on the scholarly work that I've read and the history that I've studied for this film. And from that perspective, the partition was a colonial partition. It could not have happened without British colonialism. Even the fact that we were fractured along religious lines has a lot to do with the fact that the British catalogued us that way and administered us that way. So it was almost something that was fated to happen because they created these religious divisions, or they solidified these religious divisions that might have already been there, but they solidified them through administration, through surveys. So academically, thinking academically, I would say that the partition is a colonial process and it should not have happened. But on a very personal level, I can see what's happening in India, for example, right now. And the violence that's that the Muslim communities face in India at this moment. And that's really terrifying. And so from that point of view, I can truly appreciate the fact that I was born in Pakistan. And I think of that as I can think of it as a blessing that I was born in Pakistan because of what I'm seeing in India right now. So I can think about it in two different ways.
I have a question and an appreciation as well. So I really appreciate the fact that how you address the nation state concept and how you told the story from the perspective of the people. Because most of the time when we talk about the division of Punjab to create the nation states of India and Pakistan, most of these stories are told through an history, especially through nationalistic perspectives, and most of the time Pakistan is usually demonized that it was part like a wholesome like subcontinent was a country before 1947 and the nation state of India, which is post 1947, existed before that. So you really came up with that strong balance that nation state is an imagined concept and it is still evolving and it leads to a lot of problems in modern times. So my question is your collaboration with an Indian filmmaker, because definitely nationalism usually comes into play. What were the dynamics of that relationship and how did you form that balance in the film? Because usually both filmmakers have their also nationalistic approaches as well. How did you strike that balance?
Thank you for that question and all that you said about nation states, which I totally agree with, that the concept of the nation state itself is very problematic. And it is almost, to me, it is a Western idea that was imposed on the rest of the world. So, for example, and this is something that Rabindranath Tagore, for example, wrote about this. He wrote an essay on nationalism, like in the early 1900s, right? So way before partition, in which he was questioning whether Western-style nationalism would be a good fit for India, for British India. Because India is so used to multiplicities and diversity and contradictions and confusions and overlaps, that it is able to absorb all of this. And so if you impose this template, which is very Western on India, on British India, it's going to lead to so much violence, which in fact it did. So so the whole concept of the nation state is something that I question. And it's a very, relatively speaking, a very modern concept, right? Like 1947 is not so long ago. The Indian subcontinent is much, much older than that, right? So it's a very modern concept. And then as far as how did Surbhi and I kind of work on this together with, our different views about the partition, both of us are very suspicious of nationalism. So that worked really well, because both of us feel that way. And we question nationalism in our own way. So that was not really a challenge or a struggle at all. And then when we started working together, I made it very clear that I would love to collaborate, but that there had to be one person who would be in charge of editing and who would be in charge of the final product of the rough cut, who would have control over that. And Surbhi was busy with other projects at the time, and she said, I'm happy for you to do that. So that was something that was very clear from the beginning. And so this is why you see a lot of the aesthetics that I use in my artwork, you see them in the film as well. And the way that I do a lot of my other like activist or artwork are also the ways that I sort of used in creating this film, because I had control over the final cut of the film.
Hello.
I hope I am.
Thanks for making the film, and really happy that we could see it here in Pakistan. And I wish it would have been quicker, but better late than never.
Yes.
So my question is about the future. So you said, one of your motivations for making the film was this realization that a generation was may not is there now, but may not be there, in the future. So you were capturing this oral history. So that's one thing that's happening, that generation, is waning or becoming less, and then you have the new generations. So maybe that trauma, maybe there'll be less of that trauma, and in fact, even in the leaderships of the country. So that could be a difference. So the different effects. So that generation sort of going in the background, the younger generation coming forward, and then the whole experience of partition, and then what's happened since then. What hopes and aspirations do you have for the future, in light of partition, in light of your experience of actually making the film?
Well, thank you for your question. We in one of the screenings of the film, which was in California, there was a professor in the audience who's South Asian herself, and she's a professor at Stanford. And she said something that really stayed with me. She said that this is a forward-looking film. And I truly hope that it is a forward-looking film. I truly hope that we can, like Surbhi in the film talks about, she imagines a world where she could just take a bus and cross the border very quickly and have lunch in Lahore with her friends. So that is the dream. At least a porous border where it's easy to travel across the border, where there's not so much distrust between the people on both sides, and more interaction and maybe more collaboration between people from both sides. And I think that's something that people yearn for. I know that in Pakistan, there are many projects where they're always trying to approach the other and collaborate and create art together, create literature together. So that I think that longing has always been there in the people, and I feel like a lot of it is political manipulation, trying to create this hostility between two countries because many powerful people benefit from that. So I'm not sure exactly how we do it, but that is the dream. That is the way to look forward. And I hope that perhaps with the newer generation, like you said, because they are more removed from the partition, perhaps it'll be easier for them. On the other hand, I also feel that because there's no connection with people on the other side of the border, it also makes it harder. So, I hope that people. The thing is that the way that the hostility between India and Pakistan and the distrust between the two countries is kind of a remnant of colonialism. It's a continuation of the divide and rule policy of the British colonizers. So my hope is that one day we can move away from that colonialism and really come to grips with who we are as South Asians.
Assalamu alaikum. Actually, perfect segue to what I was going to make a comment on and then ask a question on. So first of all, congratulations on living in Rochester. I was in Rochester many, many years ago, beautiful city. So, and I'm visiting from Houston. So this actually happened to be very serendipitous for us to watch this film. The question or the comment that I have is there is a similar project that was undertaken by Steven Spielberg in the mid-90s, where he documented the survivors of the Holocaust, and whoever was surviving, they basically made a big film archive of. And NPR does this thing as well, where they have these stories that they tell. I think this is a very important topic what you have documented, right? I have lost my grandparents. We used to hear these stories, but they've gone, and they've gone with them, right? And I was studying urban design and all of this many, many years ago, and I actually started a project of cognitive mapping. And what you talked about, this process of colonization, and then independence, and then the maturity or the process of a nation building, So you've got these cultures and these traditions and these processes that were occurring. Colonialism came and chopped it, and now you're basically starting over again. And you're following that narrative in the voices that you're hearing between the older generation and the younger generation. And I think that's part of the process of what's happening. So in my mind, this is a great project. And as Moin said, this is a future-looking project because I think there's a lot of other stories to be told. This can actually become a series and actually can document and help us heal as a process in some of the questions that have been asked earlier. So I'm sorry, this is not much of a question, but much more of a statement. But anyway, I'll stop with that.
No, thank you so much for your question, and wonderful to connect with another Rochesterian. I love the city of Rochester. I became a filmmaker in the city of Rochester. So it's a very important part of my life. The collection of these histories, of these oral histories, is, of course, we're trying to do that in our film, but it's also being done by this project called I think it's called the 1947 Partition Project. It used to be a project out of Stanford, I think, and now I think that the archive has moved to Berkeley, I believe, and they were actually doing crowdfunding for their project at the same time that we were doing crowdfunding for the post-production of our film. So that's how I became aware of that project. And they have really been, so their whole objective is to just collect and archive these histories. And with an urgency, because like you said, we are losing that generation. So they have collected thousands and thousands, I think tens of thousands of stories from both sides, from all over South Asia. And so there is a project which is doing that, which is wonderful, that they're collecting and archiving all of this information, which is a very important part of our history.
Thank you very much. My name is Iqbal Jatoi, and I was not able to watch the whole full movie. I was a little late. I was reflecting when I was watching it. I come from Sindh, and probably looking at the horrors and the bloodshed that we have seen in Punjab, that has been documented. We hear these stories, but when I reflect on these things in Sindh, probably one or two people had died or were killed. It went so peacefully. So what is that made Punjab so vulnerable, were hatred between the two communities so strong that it led to such a great bloodbath that we have never heard in history. So I was just reflecting on while I was watching the movie, the film. Yeah.
Thank you for your question. I'm not exactly, I am of course more familiar with the history of the partition in the Punjab. That's really the topic of this film. So I'm more informed about that, less informed about what happened in the Sindh province. But I know that that is also a very painful history. Yeah. One of the books that I used to provide some of the historical context to the film is The Long Partition by Wazira Zamidar. And she actually does focus on stories from Sindh. And then I have many Indian friends who feel that their families were ethnically cleansed at the time of partition. So maybe not a bloody ethnic cleansing, but an ethnic cleansing nevertheless, and still feel a very strong attachment to Sindh. And sometimes, not even being able to come back and visit Sindh, but having this very, very strong attachment, these very strong ties to Sindhi culture, Sindhi language, Sindhi history, and identifying as Sindhi, but having been ethnically cleansed in around 1947. So maybe the process that was used for ethnic cleansing was a little bit different, but there's a lot of pain there as well. A lot of pain.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Daud. I'm also visiting from the United States and very blessed to be here today. Thank you for the screening. I wanted to start with just a quick statement from a young person coming from the Desi diaspora in the United States. For us, you know, a lot of my friends are Indians in the US, right? And because we share so many similarities when we're there. And so I really do want to say, from a young person's perspective, I would love to see a porous border as well. And I guess a question, it was kind of touched on earlier, but to everyone, you know, on both sides of the border is, how can we make both places more hospitable, right? In the future, can we have more Hindus living in Pakistan and vice versa?
Yes. Yes.
And yeah, that's definitely a question I would like to open up. But secondly, just from a creative standpoint, I was curious, when a project lasts for 7 years, how do you see it all the way through from a creative standpoint? Because props to you for seeing it all the way through.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. And yes, and thank you for saying that you believe in porous borders as well. I am actually very much opposed to the idea of national borders anyways. I feel that these are very, for example, the border between India and Pakistan is completely a colonial fabrication. It is not embedded in any kind of indigenous knowledge or indigenous logic. It is completely arbitrary, you know, going across farmland and roads and through villages and just dividing on a very arbitrary basis. So these borders have actually make no sense for the people who actually live there. Same with the border, for example, between Afghanistan and the northern part of Pakistan. It should be a very porous border. There's the same kinds of people live and speak the same languages, live across these two borders. It doesn't make any sense. And you see, it's not even just in South Asia. You see these same kinds of arbitrary borders in Africa as well, for example, because these were ways in which colonial powers decided to divvy up the world. You know, this will belong to Britain and this will belong to France. And, you know, so this is how the world is divided. But these borders don't make any sense. So I hope, my wish is for borders to go away, actually, to be more than porous, to just go away. And yes, wouldn't it be lovely if Hindus could live in Pakistan in complete safety and, you know, in neighborhoods where Muslims were living, and the same thing with Muslims are living in India. There's a lot of Muslims in India already, almost as many as in Pakistan. But, you know, the situation in India is dire at the moment. There's a huge amount of communal violence against Muslims. So how do we take care of all these problems? That's certainly something that we need to think about. And again, if we identify more as South Asians and less as belonging to a certain nation state, you know, that might be helpful. And then your second question about the film, you know, taking such a long time to finish. In a way, it was challenging because, you know, my own thinking about the partition changed over those 7 years. So my ideas about the film actually evolved over the 7 years that I was with this material. So in a way, it was challenging, but in another way, it was also very good. I think it made for a better film because I lived with this material for so long. And I was doing these collaborations with other people, other artists for so long, that I think that many of my ideas changed and evolved, and it made for a better film.
इस फिल्म का उन्वान है अ थिन वॉल. तो हम शायद दीवारें तो ना गिरा सकें, लेकिन हम उन दीवारों में दरवाजे बना सकते हैं, उनमें हम खिड़कियां बना सकते हैं ताकि हम उस दीवार के दूसरी तरफ भी देख सकें और ताज़ा हवा जो है वो दोनों तरफ ट्रैवल करें. तो आपने जो ज़िंदगी के यहाँ 7 साल इन्वेस्ट किए हैं, एंड चूँकि थोड़ा सा मुझे भी पोस्ट प्रोडक्शन और प्रोडक्शन का थोड़ा सा तजर्बा है, तो आई नो ये कितना एग्जॉस्टिव जो है ये सारा एक्सपीरियंस होता है. और 7 साल इज़ ह्यूज ड्यूरेशन. लेकिन मैं बस ये कहना चाहूँगा कि ये आपकी जो एफर्ट है, और ख़ास तौर पे इस बुनियाद पे कि ये सरहद पार कोलेब्रेशन हुई है, तो इट इज़ एन अटेम्प्ट फॉर अ बेटर रिलेशन बिटवीन बोथ द नेशंस, और एक दूसरे के नज़दीक लाने की ये एक अटेम्प्ट है. और बहुत एप्रिसिएशन आपके लिए. आई होप आपके जो फ्यूचर प्रोजेक्ट्स हों वो भी इसी तरीके से सक्सेसफुल हों. And thank you very much for all that you did. Thank you.
थैंक यू सो मच, बहुत
Thank you,
शुक्रिया
Mara.
आपका।
Thank
थैंक
you
यू। और
very
खासतौर
much.
पे जो आपने कहा है कि थिन वॉल है, लेकिन इसमें दरवाजे भी हो सकते हैं, इसमें खिड़कियां भी हो सकती हैं, और इसमें से हम एक दूसरे को देख सकते हैं। That is truly beautiful, and that is truly what we're trying to achieve through this film.
Thank you, everyone, for coming here. We have a very diverse audience today, people from all across the Federation, from Sindh, from Gilgit-Baltistan. We've got people from the diaspora, we've got foreigners here, we've got people of different generation, university students, senior citizens. So it's a very diverse audience. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mara, for making this film and allowing us to screen it for the first time in Pakistan. I think this is a very necessary project, and this project may not be possible 10 years down the line, because the people who have this lived memory of partition, they're all, even if they were 5 or 6 years old, they are now in their mid 80s or early 80s. They're not going to be around for a long time. So I think such projects are very, very necessary at this moment, because this is the last moment that we can manage such projects. We won't be able to make these again. So yeah, I think this is very important. Thank you for allowing us, and thank you to the Black Hole, to Nair for allowing us to screen this, to Faisal for managing the audio, and to Alam for making this wonderful chalk art photo, of which I'm going to send you before we rub it off. We wipe it off and we'll send that photo to you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Osama, I just want to thank you for organizing the screening, and thank you to the Black Hole as well for supporting my work. I really appreciate it. And I hope that we can work again together. I would love that.
We would love that too. Thank you.